Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 130, Monte Cristo. I'm going to delve into a little bit of the paranormal for this, and I have done an earlier episode on a haunted house in Deniliquin. Well, this haunted house is in Junee. Christopher Crawley and his wife Elizabeth purchased a significant amount of land in Junee, New South Wales in the 1880s, and they decided to build a homestead on a hill overlooking the town that they called the Monte Cristo Homestead. There are claims that members of the Crawley family haunt the estate. The homestead is a tourist attraction today, and you can visit the home. The website actually states that the homestead is Australia's most haunted house. Christopher William Crawley was born in Sydney in 1841 to William Augustus Crawley and Ellen Redding. William Augustus Crawley was Irish, and he married Ellen Redding in Cork on the 18th of July 1838. They emigrated very soon after their marriage, embarking from Plymouth, England on the 31st of July 1838 aboard the ship the Fairlie, which arrived in New South Wales. They were government assistant bounty immigrants, and they arrived on the 6th of December 1838. In 1843, William Crawley was a storekeeper at Parramatta Hospital under Dr. Hill, and he got himself into trouble. He claimed he was told by Dr. Hill to supply a family of immigrants some medication that were engaged by Dr. Hill. In the Sydney Australian, on the 10th of October 1844, William Augustus Crawley and Levi Abrahams are charged on stealing medicines. Levi Abrahams and William Augustus Crawley were indicted for stealing a quantity of medicines, the property of Her Majesty, from the dispensary of the General Hospital, Liverpool, on the 28th of August. James Eckford, the assistant colonial surgeon at Liverpool, proved that Crawley was dispenser and Abrahams the clerk at the Liverpool Hospital. In consequence of Mr. Croft, the Purveyor General, and Mr. Miles, Commissioner of Police, coming to the hospital, examined the medicines and missed a large quantity of various descriptions contained in bottles like those produced in court, which exactly corresponded with the medicines supplied by Mr. Croft for the use of patients in the hospital. John Weirin, Chief Inspector of Police, produced 2 cases of medicine, which he procured from Mr. Cohen's auction room, and a quantity of sarsaparilla from a man named Bayliss. Several communications addressed to a person named Flanner in King Street West relative to the medicines consigned to him, signed by the prisoner Crawley, and in his handwriting were put in and read. In one of them, a list of drugs and medicines were enclosed with instructions with how they were to be disposed of, and stated that their value in England would be about £50. Dr. Edford was recalled and cross-examined at considerable length by the prisoner Crawley, who endeavoured to show that the missing articles were expended by the witness himself in administering his private patients. Bernard Conroy, surgeon and apothecary, deposed to purchasing a quantity of medicine at Mr. Cohen's auction, which he showed to Mr. Croft. The bottles produced were some of the same. The witness returned the medicines to Mr. Cohen, and he returned the witness's money he had paid for them. Why did Mr. Croft return them? Well, it struck him that they'd been made up in a different manner to generally the drugs disposed of at the auction, and Mr. Croft immediately recognised the handwriting of Crawley upon some of the bottles. Thomas Bayliss, a dealer, deposed that the cases produced were the same that he received from William Flanner to dispose of, which he'd left at Mr. Cohen's for sale, and he was to receive his usual commission of 5%. William Flanner of Castlereagh Street, Sydney, deposed that the prisoner Crawley called on him on the 23rd of August, left some cases of medicine in his charge, and subsequently sent him down the invoice and letters of instruction respecting their sale. He then gave the cases to the last witness to leave at Mr. Cohen's auction rooms for sale. Crawley told him to sell one of the bags containing drugs and to send the other one up to Liverpool again, but to not say anything about it to Levi. A brass plate with W.A. Crawley on it. The witness took off one of the boxes by Crawley's directions. He first became acquainted with Crawley by a letter of introduction he brought from the prisoner Abrahams, upon which occasion he consulted him in the best mode of selling some drugs to the best advantage. William Clyburn, lately assigned to the hospital at Liverpool, deposed that Crawley sent him to Mr. Simpson's to get a spring cart, which he brought to the hospital. At 4 o'clock in the morning, he was called by the watchman to go for the horse and put it in the cart. He did so, and Crawley and his wife got up into the cart and went off to Sydney. It was so dark that he did not observe anything particular in the cart. John McGowan, the contractor for the hospital, deposed he received a letter from Crawley on the 5th of September to deliver to Flanner in Sydney, which he delivered to Flanner's wife. Sophia Thomas, 13 years old, said she lived at Flanner's when Crawley brought the bags and boxes produced there. She saw Flanner take the brass plate off one of the boxes. This closed the case for the prosecution. The prisoner Crawley stated in his defence that the medicines produced were part of a consignment sent out to him by his father, who was in good circumstances at home. Abraham stated that Crawley had told him that the drugs had been sent to him by his father, and he had no further participation in the transaction with Crawley, other than writing the letter to Flanner for him at his request. Mary Redding, the sister-in-law to Crawley, stated that she arrived in the colony free in 1841 and brought out 2 letters, a case of medicine, a violin, a case of razors, a jar of spirits, and a piece of linen for him from his father. I have been living at Crawley's for the last 6 months and have not seen the medicine chest within that period. The judge, summing up, drawed the attention to the jury for the disproportionate weight of evidence against the prisoner Crawley. The jury retired for 5 minutes and returned the following verdict: Crawley guilty, Abraham's not guilty. So in the end, he was charged with stealing medicine to the value of £40. He was convicted on the 26th of October 1844 and sentenced to 7 years transportation to Van Diemen's Land aboard the Water Lily. And on the 22nd of January 1847, it states that William Augustus Crawley is a dispenser at Saltwater River, and it states that he examined a prisoner's injuries. Unfortunately, William was not to see his wife and children again. He died in Hobart Hospital on the 12th of October 1847, aged only 34. Ellen Crawley then went on to marry Henry William Hilton after her husband's death. Henry Hilton was English and was 6 years older than Helen. He'd arrived in New South Wales in 1838 and was a policeman stationed at Tumut from 1844 and rose to Chief Constable in 1847, but had to resign in 1850 after being drunk on duty. And the article outlining that event says, Henry Hilton, Chief Constable at Tumut, for being drunk. The defendant, thinking discretion is the better part of valour, put an end to the matter by tendering his resignation, which was accepted by the bench, very likely thinking at the same time that he who fights and runs away may live to fight another day, and hoping perchance that some good-natured JPs may be found to recommend him as a fit and proper person to hold a similar situation somewhere else. He stayed in Tumut and he became the Inspector of Distilleries by the time he married Ellen in Yass on the 4th of April 1849. They had 5 children together. In 1853, Henry became Tumut's first schoolmaster, and in 1856 was the district registrar, and then became an auctioneer in 1858. In 1866, he became the licensee of the commercial hotel, which is quite ironic, and also a mining registrar in 1879. So he continued to be quite a prolific townsperson, despite his earlier misdemeanour. On the 23rd of June 1859, it mentions in Tumut, stolen from Christopher Crawley, near Tumut, on the 23rd of March, 1 bay colt, and Mr. Henry Hilton of Tumut offers a reward of £5 on conviction, or £2 if it was strayed on delivery to the post office Tumut. So from that, it's quite clear that Henry Hilton has taken on the parenting of his stepchildren as well as the 5 children they had. Ellen died in Tumut on the 12th of August 1884 at the age of 66. Now, initially, Christopher grew up in the inner city suburb of Balmain, and then at an early age went to Tumut, where his mother and stepfather went to live, and he remained there until he was 19, when he was engaged by Mr. A. Watson of Adelong, in whose employ he continued for 9 years. He then took up a free selection on the Murrumbidgee River and remained on it for 9 years. In 1860, he married Elizabeth Carr. Some sources say that Elizabeth Carr was a Wiradjuri woman, and she did not acknowledge that throughout her life in order to be accepted by society. The marriage announcement says Crawley Carr. On September 22nd, by Reverend Father O'Neill at the residence of the bridegroom's parents in Tumut, Mr. Christopher William Crawley of Upper Adelong eldest son of the late Dr. Crawley of Liverpool, to Miss Lydia Elizabeth Carr of Upper Adelong, youngest daughter of the late Mr. John Carr of Sydney. Elizabeth was a governess at Upper Adelong at the time of their marriage. Records show that Elizabeth was born at Kelso on the 10th of July 1842. Her baptism record, however, says she was the daughter of Joseph Carr and Sarah. There is another record, though, of another baptism in 1841 in Sydney to John Carr and Anne. So she's a little bit of a mystery in her upbringing. Christopher Crawley suffered in consequence of the drought, but he eventually discovered a spring which later supplied the township of Junee with water. The Crawley family struggled financially for quite a while. They first lived in a slab house on the property that he obtained and then upgraded to a brick cottage. However, in 1878 their fortunes changed as Christopher obtained a hotel licence soon after the Great Southern Railway line opened in Junee. He soon obtained a victualler's licence and built the Railway Hotel, which was opposite the railway station, and this was a very lucrative decision. He soon had the ability to buy numerous blocks of land around the township, which eventually amounted to 1,300 acres, and he soon became one of the wealthiest men in town, and this enabled him to build the Monte Cristo Homestead in 1884 that contained 11 rooms. In a recollection in the Daily Advertiser, a Wagga Wagga newspaper in 1936, it stated that the village of Junee only consisted of Crawley's Hotel, the adjoining railway store, and some scattered slab huts. The entire village benefited enormously from travellers through the railway line and agricultural trade, and Crawley is seen to be one of the town's founders. He was much loved, and he was a generous man with a big sense of civic responsibility. Mrs. Crawley was remembered as very like Queen Victoria. She usually wore a black lace dress, a lace cap with a stand-up beaded collar, and she ruled the house with an iron rod with her husband, and they seemed to be the quintessential Victorian-era couple. But perceptions were often misleading. Staff would later recount stories of harsh mistreatment by their employers, which they believe are some of the ghosts that haunt the home today. Christopher Crawley died at Monte Cristo Homestead on the 14th of December 1910 from a combination of heart failure and blood poisoning. He had a carbuncle on his neck that got infected by it rubbing against his starched collar. Elizabeth Crawley couldn't cope with her husband's death. She locked herself inside the house, and she spent most of her time up in the attic, where she built a small chapel. In her remaining 23 years of her life after her husband's death, she only left Monte Cristo Homestead twice. And upon the death of Christopher, there was an article in the paper. Christopher William Crawley, one of the pioneers of the town and district, was a native of Liverpool, New South Wales, the third son of Dr. Crawley of that town. He then selected land adjoining the village of Junee, namely portion 112 of 400 acres and portion 113 of 120 acres in the parish of South Junee, both under conditional purchases. He applied for portion 108 of 320 acres on the eastern side of the railway line under conditional purchase in 1876, and then portion 122 of 160 acres in 1877. He sold blocks of land from time to time and built a handsome villa, Monte Cristo. Old files of the period record terms and conditions of Crawley's estate, Junee Junction, comprising of 132 allotments to be sold by public auction. When Mr. Crawley died in 1910, he left a widow and 4 daughters and 3 sons. Mrs. Crawley continued to reside at Monte Cristo with her daughter, Miss L.B. Crawley, and after she died on the 12th of August 1933 at the age of 92, Miss L.B. Crawley continued to reside at Monte Cristo. The trustees sold a considerable portion of the estate in 1921, but still hold a large portion of the town, in addition to 1,300 acres of farming land within the municipality. Mr. Crawley had large tracts of farming and grazing land outside the municipality, and 10 months later, on the 31st of October 1911, it announces the will of the late Mr. C.W. Crawley. Probate has been granted in respect of the will of Mr. Christopher William Crawley, grazier of Junee. He appointed his widow, Elizabeth Lydia Crawley, as sole trustee of his estate. After her death, his sons Mervyn Marmaduke and Aubrey Clarence Crawley and daughter Florence Angela are to be trustees. He bequeathed the use and occupation of his dwelling house at Junee, known as Monte Cristo, The furniture, plates, pictures, household effects, horses and carriages, and also the income of the estate to his widow for life, and after her death the estate be divided amongst his children in equal shares. The net value of his estate for stamp duty purposes was estimated at £46,110, the bulk of which is real estate. So as mentioned, Elizabeth Crawley died at Monte Cristo on the 12th of August 1933 at 91 years old due to a ruptured appendix. And in the Catholic Freeman's Journal, it announces her death and says that Elizabeth Lydia Crawley, a well-known figure in the life of the Junee community, reached an advanced age of 91 years and had been ill for over 6 months. Previous to that, she enjoyed good health and was most active. The Crawley name has been intimately associated with the growth of Junee and the district ever since. She was a devoted member of the Catholic Church and took a very keen interest in the building of the new edifice, having of course watched the growth of the parish before and after the first building on the hill was erected. In its day, the homestead was renowned as one of the region's social centres. Balls were held and the local gentry engaged in country pursuits such as tennis and golf on the region's golf course. Between these social events, the Crawleys raised 7 children. The firstborn was Christopher Jr. He was born in Sherman in 1862. There's no death record to be found, so the assumption was that he was stillborn. The second child, Helen Lillian Ann Crawley, known as Lillian, was the great beauty of the family. She was an accomplished pianist and composer. Helen married Frederick Kearns Lawless in Junee on the 6th of April 1885. They had 3 children. Helen composed the Scotia Skoshiski in 1895 for a ball at Government House and dedicated it to Lady Dunbar. Prior to 1891, Frederick was a cordial manufacturer in Wagga Wagga, but voluntarily applied for bankruptcy in November 1891. He was then an auctioneer and a stock and station agent, and he passed away in 1910 at Muddaborough, Queensland, aged only 48. Helen died in Sydney on the 8th of August 1946 at the age of 83. Mervyn Marmaduke Crawley was born in 1865 in Sherman. He married Bridget Ann Donnelly in Junee on the 17th of January 1881 at North Junee Station at the home of her mother. By the accounts of the marriage notice in the Wagga Wagga newspaper, it was quite an event for the town. They had 8 children together. Mervyn was a publican of the Railway Hotel at Narromine in 1895, and he was known as the pioneer of Queensland. He owned and operated extensive pastoral holdings in the state. He went there about 1880 and acquired 1,200 acres in the Goondiwindi district. By 1908, he'd acquired an additional 13,000 acres. Mervyn died at Goondiwindi on the 9th of April 1940 at the age of 75. Aubrey Clarence Crawley was born in 1866 in Wagga Wagga. He played the violin and attended Sydney University to become a doctor. He practised at Minmi, New South Wales in the early 1900s. He married Annie Mary McManus at Junee in 1921 when he was 55 and Annie 29. Annie was born in Ireland and was a school teacher at Junee at the time of their marriage. They had 3 children, with 2 daughters surviving infancy. When he was at Minmi, he was based at Brown's Collieries, and then he was honorary surgeon at Wallsend District Hospital and also medical superintendent at Newcastle Hospital. They moved to Sydney by the early 1920s, and Aubrey died at Randwick on the 26th of July 1937 at the age of 71. William H. Crawley was born in 1868 and died at the age of 3. Mildred Clarissa Crawley was born in 1870 in Sherman, and there's no death record for her, so the assumption is she was stillborn. Lydia Blanche Crawley was born in 1872 in Sherman. She did not marry and lived at Monte Cristo for most of her life. In 1954, she lived at Bellevue Hill, Sydney, and Lydia died on the 29th of December 1957 in Sydney, aged 85. Florence Angela Crawley was born in 1874 in Sherman. She married Michael James Heffernan in Junee in 1907 when they were both 33. They had 5 children. Michael was a grazier and they lived at Loma Langi near Junee, although in the 1940s they were living at Monte Cristo and they sold it in 1948. Florence died at Killara, New South Wales on the 18th of June 1964 at the age of 90. The 9th child, Alphonse Hilary Crawley, was born in Balmain, New South Wales in 1877. He was said to be a fine pianist. He was a solicitor and broke the Australian record by practising continually for 62 years. He practised in Junee. Alphonse married Ethel Margaret Marshall in Barmedman, New South Wales in 1910 when he was 33. They had 7 children, 6 surviving infancy. Their daughter Ethel died at Monte Cristo at just 10 months old in 1917. The nursemaid dropped her on the stairs. The nursemaid claimed that she was pushed by an unseen force, but she wasn't believed. They had a son, Christopher William Crawley, who died in Italy in World War II at the age of 21. He had enlisted in Deniliquin, New South Wales in 1941 after his training in the RAF. On the 2nd of July 1942, it was announced the engagement of Miss Margaret Mary, known as Peg, Sullivan, younger daughter of the late Mr. J.J. Sullivan and Mrs. Sullivan of Vaucluse, to Sergeant Pilot Christopher Crawley, RAAF, youngest son of Mr. and Mrs. Alphonse R. Crawley of Junee. And devastatingly for his fiancée, he died on the 14th of December 1943. And Alphonse Crawley died on the 19th of August 1966 in Junee at the age of 89. The 10th child was Angelina Christina Crawley, known to the family as Pidge, and she was born on the 23rd of October 1884 in Balmain, New South Wales. She was a talented artist who enjoyed sketching and pen drawings. She married Mr. Edwin Rayleigh Heffernan in Junee in 1928 when she was 44 and Edwin 48, and Angelina died at Bellevue Hill, New South Wales on the 20th of September 1949 at the age of 64. And as you would have picked up, the girls were all musically talented and they received education at the best schools their parents could afford, including the Dominican Convent in Maitland and St Vincent's at Potts Point. They were taught music and painting in these educational institutions. The boys were educated at Riverview and St Joseph's in Sydney and St Patrick's in Goulburn. Now, some family trees also have Christopher William Crawley, the father of other children. There was a girl, Sarah Brown, who had a son that she named John Curley. And a family tree has DNA indicating that John Curley, born on the 6th of May 1881 at Hamilton, New South Wales, near Newcastle, is the child of Christopher William Crawley and Sarah Brown. His birth certificate names Sarah Brown and James Curley as the parents, as Sarah was married to James Curley at the time and was living at Newcastle. Sarah was 25 and Christopher 40 at the time of this child's birth. John Curley lived in Sydney and died in 1952 at the age of 70. And now a little on the homestead. Well, as mentioned, the last member of the Crawley family left the house when they sold it in 1948. The house actually remained empty for more than a decade. There were several caretakers at the house trying to keep an eye on things, but unfortunately they couldn't prevent the place from being vandalised. All of the original furnishings were removed and sold, and the house remained in a poor state until it was bought by Reginald and Olive Ryan in 1963. The Ryans restored the homestead back to its original state, and then they turned it into a museum for tours, including a doll museum. They have an antique store in it as well. Reginald died in 2014, but his wife Olive continues to be the caretaker of the home. When the Ryans moved into the homestead, they did notice some strange things going on. When they went up to the house with their belongings, including their cat and dog, they noticed the animals did not want to go into the house. In fact, they both ran away from it. And later, when they had an evening out, they noticed all the lights were on when they were approaching the house, but as soon as they opened the front door, the lights were off. Olive recalls hearing her name called out multiple times, only to find herself in solitude. Their children too reported sightings of figures dressed in old-fashioned attire and an unnerving sensation of cold hands resting upon their shoulders. Those that believe in paranormal say the homestead is haunted by at least 10 ghosts, some of them more prominent than others. When the Ryans came home one night, they found all their chickens strangled to death in the poultry run and their parrot choked to death in its cage, and also a litter of kittens raised in the breakfast room were all brutally killed. The belief is that Christopher Crawley's ghost now haunts the room in which he died. He makes sporadic appearances within the hallways of the homestead, but is not as commonly sighted as his wife, and he appears to quietly pace and does not bother anyone. The most seen apparition at Monte Cristo Homestead is Elizabeth Crawley. She's often referred to as the Lady in Grey. She still rules the house with an iron fist, judging everyone who dares to enter her house. If she doesn't like you, she will scare you out with ice-cold air falling on your skin. Her presence is often felt, and she's often seen at the top of the grand staircase, eerily watching over the house with an otherworldly gaze. Her frequent sightings occur mainly in the small room that she transformed into a chapel and spent most of her time in. They describe her as a shadowy figure, dressed in sombre black attire and carrying a gleaming silver cross. The intensity of her haunting is such that she's been known to scare people out of the dining room. There are stories that Christopher Crawley had gotten two of his maids pregnant. One of them committed suicide by jumping to her death from the balcony, and she was pregnant when she did so. She hit the stairs and was instantly killed, and the belief is her ghost still haunts the veranda, and there is blood-stained marks on the spot where she met her end. The second pregnant maid gave birth to a son, whom she named Harold, and when Harold was a young boy, he was involved in a terrible accident on the premises. He was hit by a coach. He was survived by the accident but sustained head trauma which disabled him for life, and the poor boy was kept on chains in the coach room. Local children would mock him as he would scream all day. They called him a monster, and the children of Junee challenged each other to find him and pester him. He was eventually taken to an asylum after he was found by the authorities chained to his mother's bed. He died at the asylum but still haunts the grounds of the homestead and makes his presence known by the sound of chains. There is the belief that there's a young stable boy named Morris that also haunts the coach house. He didn't feel well one day and decided to stay in bed at the coach house. His master didn't approve the fact that the boy slept in and decided to teach him a lesson. He put the boy's straw mattress on fire, thinking he would jump up and get to work, but Morris was too ill and couldn't get up and died in his bed. People still hear his screams up until today. And Crawley's infant granddaughter Ethel, who died in 1917 because the nursemaid dropped her on the stairs. Well, today children who visit the museum become irritable and upset when they enter the stairs. Some guests say they feel as though they're being pushed on their backs or even sense an eerie moisture. Some claim to feel an ice-cold tiny hand slip into theirs when they go to the upstairs rooms. Many visitors also report the eerie sound of a child's laughter echoing through the house. And there's a phantom coachman, forever committed to his role, that roams the grounds. On moonless nights, people hear the haunting clip-clop of horse hooves and the rattle of carriage wheels. Lights still come on and off. Guests experience a feeling of nausea, overwhelming sadness, and some people even faint during tours. The unexplained phenomenon confuses and frightens countless visitors. People have also noticed eerie apparitions that are captured in photographs and mirrors. There were numerous times when Olive was alone and heard someone walking out on the balcony, only to look and confirm that no one was there. She told a TV show back in 2015 that she'd felt a hand on her shoulder at least once, and she believed that it was Elizabeth Crawley trying to communicate to her. Her son Lawrence had his share of experiences as well in his childhood. He said that he and his siblings have seen all the figures in period clothing wandering around the house and have felt their ice-cold hands touch them. But the most horrifying story he's told by far is about the family cat. He said, "We've never been able to keep animals in the house. Ever since Mum came downstairs one morning and found the family cat on the kitchen floor, skinned and disemboweled with its eyes gouged out. Someone suggested that another wild animal could have done that, but all the doors were closed and locked." Since opening up the rooms as a bed and breakfast, Lawrence said that even the guests are experiencing things, like something touching their feet in the middle of the night or an uncomfortable pressure on their chests, like someone is leaning or sitting on them. Some have seen apparitions standing at the foot of their bed staring at them. Some have reported people walking back and forth in the hallway outside their room and stopping to jiggle their door handle as though they're trying to get in. And there's numerous reports of disembodied voices. Some of the guests go and sleep in their cars rather than make it through the night in the house, and some just leave the property completely. And Lawrence says the spirits tend to stay away from the nervous Nellies. It's the skeptics that get the most activity. And a man from the Traveller magazine wrote a story on the homestead and stayed the night. And the following morning when he was leaving, he asked Lawrence about the rather large dog he'd seen running out of the house before he went to bed. Lawrence looked at him with a puzzled expression on his face and said he didn't know what dog he was talking about. They didn't have a dog. And also, there were 3 sons. Christopher Crawley was one son. I have only been able to find evidence of one sibling, so 2 sons, not 3 children. And interestingly, Christopher and his brother William do not have birth certificates recorded in New South Wales. So Christopher Crawley's brother William Augustus Crawley was born in 1843 in New South Wales. He married Mary Ann Russell in Adelong in 1880 when he was 37 and Mary 24. They had a daughter, Helena Cecilia Crawley, in Wagga on the 9th of March 1885. William Augustus Crawley ran the Enterprise Hotel at Old Junee, which closed in 1932. William's wife died on Christmas Eve 1888 in Junee, aged only 32, and there's an article in the Junee News outlining her death. A fatal accident occurred to Mrs. Crawley of Old Junee through her dress accidentally catching fire about 8 a.m. While Mr. Crawley and others were at breakfast, a lad named McCarthy came as usual with a pint of milk to Mrs. Crawley, who went into the kitchen to get some hot water out of the fountain, then on the fire to wash out the jug to put the milk in, and while doing so her dress caught fire. Mrs. Crawley tried to extinguish the fire with her hands but was unable to do so. The dress she had on being a print with very light underclothing, and it soon became aflame. The boy McCarthy ran in to tell Mr. Crawley immediately, who ran into the kitchen to his wife's assistance. When he saw what had happened, he ran into the bedroom for a blanket and rolled it around Mrs. Crawley to smother the fire. But before that was done, all the lower part of her body and legs were severely burnt. Mrs. Crawley was put to bed at once and her injuries attended to, and a wire sent to Dr. Kavanagh, who proceeded to Mrs. Crawley at once. On his arrival, he saw that the unfortunate lady was so badly burnt it was impossible for her to recover. Mrs. Crawley only lived 5 hours. A magisterial inquiry was held, and they were of the opinion that the death was the result of an accident. William then went on to marry Mary Maud McCarthy in Wagga on the 2nd of December 1891, when Mary was 24 and William 28. They had 3 children together, and William ran the hotel until his death on the 17th of August 1929 in Junee at the age of 86. His daughter from his first marriage, Helena Cecilia Crawley, was born in 1885 at Loftus in New South Wales. She married John McNamara in Ashfield, New South Wales on the 4th of January 1916 when she was 31. And it states that Mr. John McNamara of the firm McNamara Brothers, auctioneers of Berrigan, and Miss Helena Crawley, eldest daughter of Mr. and Mrs. W.A. Crawley of Haberfield. Mr. Cecil Crawley officiated as best man, and bridesmaid was Miss Elma Crawley. They had 5 children together, and the obituary reads, for Helena, Mrs. J. McNamara. The death occurred on Thursday morning of Mrs. Helena McNamara, wife of Mr. John McNamara, at her residence at Cobram Road. For a considerable time, this estimable lady has been stricken with ill health, and for the past few months her condition has caused her husband and family great anxiety. All through, the deceased bore her affliction with fortitude and patience, and received the greatest care and attention from her family. Mrs. McNamara was 53 years of age and lived all her married life in Berrigan. She was a woman of kindly disposition, devoted to her husband and family, and earned the highest respect and esteem of all who claimed her friendship. Her passing is sincerely regretted, and sincerest sympathy of all is extended to her bereaved husband, 3 daughters and 2 sons who are left to mourn her loss. And William's children on his second marriage. Elma Florence May Crawley was born on the 10th of September 1892 at Junee. She married Pierre Zachariah Crete in 1918 at Haberfield, New South Wales, when she was 26. They had 1 daughter, Mignon Betty Patricia Crete, in 1922, and the couple divorced in 1935. In the divorce case, it states Peter Zachariah Crete, manager of the Hydro Hotel Leeton, petitioned a divorce from Elma Florence Crete on the grounds of misconduct with John Fullerton, formerly District Superintendent for Railways at Junee. A number of witnesses were heard, including a private inquiry agent from Sydney and his assistant, and the senior detective of the New South Wales Government Railways. After hearing the evidence, His Honour found the issues proved. In 1954, the man mentioned in the divorce, James Fullerton, actually left all of his estate to Elma upon his death, and she was named as executrix. And Elma died in Sydney on the 9th of March 1964 at the age of 71. The next child was Cecil Daniel Crawley. He was born on the 29th of August 1894 in Junee. He was a barman at the Enterprise Hotel in Junee, and in 1941 enlisted in the Army at Bondi Junction. He was in the postal unit, and he was a sergeant. And he died in Junee in 1955 at the age of 61. He didn't marry. And the third child was William Clarence Crawley. He was born on the 15th of September 1898 at Junee. He married Margaret Pete Rafter in 1932 in Sydney. He was a motor mechanic, and they lived at Darlinghurst. And he died in 1961 at the age of 63. He died at St Vincent's Hospital. He was the former chauffeur to the late Archbishop Mowat, and they had 2 children, Pat and Bill. So I hope you enjoyed hearing the story of the family behind the Monte Cristo Homestead at Junee.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.